right, so today we'll talk about society and the role that socioeconomic status and rank plays in health and mortality and stress levels. That's sort of the focus today. Right, we've talked about a lot of how stress impacts specific systems in the body. Now we're looking at a bigger picture. Well, why do people have stress? Like, where is this coming from? What is the sources of this, right? And rank and socioeconomic status play a big role in that. We'll start off with a clip from our show.
Could this also be true for that other primate? As Robert Sapolsky was monitoring stress in baboons, Professor Sir Michael Marmot was leading a study in Great Britain that tracked the health of more than 28,000 people over the course of 40 years. It was named for Whitehall, citadel of the British Civil Service, where every job is ranked in a precise hierarchy. The perfect laboratory to determine whether in humans there might be a link between rank and stress.
I mean, that's the thing about stress. I think you've got to look at it in both acute terms and chronic terms. And I think I've been under chronic stress in this organisation simply because I'm a square peg in a round hole.
Kevin Brooks is a government lawyer. His rank, level 7, means he has little seniority in his department. He lives the life of a subordinate.
I think what I was most aware of at the time was the workload and how I had most of it under control, but one of my cases wasn't wholly under control. I'd let it slip. And it was a bit like, being in the car and hitting an ice patch and skidding. But nonetheless, I came in Monday morning, and my immediate manager, let's call him Ben wants to work with you. So we find a room, he shuts the door, then he says, you know what you've done, you know what happened while you were away. We couldn't find one of your files. Do you know what that meant? He just gave me a darn good kicking, you know? Psychologically, he did me over. And at the end of it, it was more threats. It was, right, there's maybe a disciplinary matter. So I left the room, crossed over the corridor to my own room, and I just burst into tears. And wept. And wept.
Sarah Woodall also works for the government. Unlike Kevin, she is a senior civil servant.
There are about 160 people reporting to me ultimately, one way or another, within the sector. I do really enjoy working in the civil service. It's quite a dynamic environment. It can be quite exciting. I like working with lots of people. So yeah, I do really enjoy my job.
Such dramatically different reflections dramatize one of the most astounding scientific findings in the Whitehall study.
Firstly, it showed that the lower you were in the hierarchy, the higher your risk of heart disease and other diseases. So people second from the top had higher risk than those at the top. People third from the top had higher risk than those second from the top. And it ran all the way from top to bottom. We're dealing with people in stable jobs with no industrial exposures, and yet your position in the hierarchy intimately related to your risk of disease and length of life.
I've been very lucky. I haven't ever experienced any problems with my health. Since I've been in the senior civil service, I haven't had a day off with ill health. So I've been very fortunate.
In my own situation, I think that my career is pretty much tainted. It's pretty much arrested because I've had, for instance, in the last 3 years at work, I've been off sick for probably half that time.
This particular study is sort of the Rosetta Stone of all field because it's the British civil service system. Everybody's got the same medical care. Everybody's got the same universal healthcare system, just like the baboons. All the baboons eat the same thing, they have the same level of activity. It's not the stuff that, oh, if you're a low-ranking baboon, you smoke too much and you drink too much, and if you're a low-ranking British civil service, you never go to the doctor and you don't get preventative vaccines. Both of these studies rule out all those confounds, and they produce virtually identical findings.
On both sides of the primate divide, there are soul-wrenching stories and life-threatening consequences. For every subordinate like Kevin living a life of baboon uncertainty, there is an alpha strutting his stuff, glorying in power over someone else, someone unsuspecting, someone low-ranking.
All right. So, and towards the end of the lecture today, we'll come back to the Whitehall study and talk a little bit more about the findings of the Whitehall study. But this sort of introduces that. And so in Britain, they organize all of their government, all their sort of governmental resources under this civil service model, right? So in America, we have the CDC, and we have the Treasury Department, and we have like all these different branches of government. We have the Environmental Control Agency and all of that. And they kind of, even though they're all government agencies, kind of work all sort of independently and are housed in different places, whereas in Britain it's all centralized. And so all those sorts of regular government things are all housed under this one branch. And it allows for this hierarchy of positions where they have all these different defined ranks. Those ranks come with set pay. So it's all sort of, it's this real hierarchy, societal structure that's in place. And as Sapolsky mentioned, now you throw into that study a bunch of controls, like everybody has universal health care, everybody has the same access to health care, everybody gets the same types of treatments. In general, everybody that is in the civil service makes enough money that they are able to eat healthy foods. I mean, they're not in poverty, and we'll talk a lot about sort of poverty and those effects also today. So that allows us to see simply that being in a different rank affects your health outcome, right? Your chance of getting diseases. So then the question is, why? What is it? And of course, Sapolsky would argue that there are different levels of stress, right, associated with that. The lower you are in the hierarchy, the greater amount of stress. And the higher you are in the hierarchy, the less stress and the more control and the more outlets for eliminating stress you have access to. Okay? So he starts off the chapter talking about the reductionist approach. What is the reductionist approach? What you guys have taught today. It's Friday. It's all for you.
That stress is high, your immunity is low, and less susceptible to disease.
Yeah, so the reductionist approach is thinking that your susceptibility to disease or your contact with viruses or bacteria or other things is sort of what is determining your health outcome, right? And the more exposure you have to these negative things, right, the more likely you are to have disease. It's sort of the medical approach, right? What are you being exposed to? And he contrasts that with the mind-body approach. What did he talk about the mind-body approach emphasize? In terms of health and disease.
Is that when you were talking about like psychological stressors and how you personally affects your health?
Yes, right? So this is saying, yeah, it's not so much how much nasty stuff you come in contact with, it's how well is your body set up to deal with that based on your mental health, your stress levels, your ability to cope with stress, and that is really what is driving sort of those outcomes, right? So the whole point of that, and he makes this point in the first couple of pages of the chapter, is that when we're talking about health outcomes, when we're talking about who's going to get disease, mortality rates, life expectancy, we have to talk about that in the context of that individual and that individual's place in society, because those things are going to influence that. And he mentions, when he talks about, well, why do we have dominance hierarchies? Why do these hierarchies exist? And in the animal world, they exist because of resource allocation, right? That there's a limited amount of resources, and therefore there's going to be alphas that are able to take advantage of the other subordinates and get more resources, and versus the subordinates then that don't get their sort of fair share. And so we'll talk, like Sapolsky does in the chapter, about the animal world for a little bit, but we really want to get to humans. And when we talk about resource allocation with humans, this is where socioeconomic status really comes into play, right? Who has access to the resources, the most resources? So, in looking at his baboon tribe, right, the people who are the subordinates are having lower basal glucocorticoid levels, which is associated with what? Not just stress, but what causes lower baseline glucocorticoid levels? I mean, not lower. I'm saying lower. Higher. So the subordinates had higher circulating levels of baseline glucocorticoid levels. Or feedback, the brakes, right, that we've talked about, right? Not having good brake system. Okay? But conversely, you think about not having a good brake system, when they're under a physical stress, the subordinates show a weaker glucocorticoid response. When they're under stress, they show a weaker glucocorticoid response, and the ability after that stressor is over compared to the dominants to return to baseline levels is delayed. And again, some of that is probably due to the brake system. So we have weaker brakes and weaker gas pedal, and in effect, the whole, he refers to this as an ineffective stress response system. And so all of this then correlates with what we've seen about the negative impact of chronic glucocorticoid levels, where we get elevated blood pressure, a sluggish cardiovascular response. So just like we have a sluggish stress response, there's a sluggish cardiovascular response. And different chemical hormone levels are in an imbalance in negative, unhealthy ways, like not having enough of the good cholesterol circulating, which remember helps move those lipid particles around, right? Having lower testosterone, lower white blood cell counts, lower growth factors, and so all of this then leads to the things that we've seen about suppression of growth, suppression of cardiovascular system, suppression of effective blood glucose levels, all of these things. All right, so one of the studies that or questions that they were wanted to answer is, okay, well, what makes baboon an alpha dominant or a subordinate? Is it which came first? Was being subordinate result in the broken stress system or the ineffective stress system? Or did the monkeys that have the ineffective stress systems were predisposed to become subordinates, and the ones that were dominant were better able to cope with stress and had stronger stress systems and thus became the dominant ones? And so they did a study where they had monkeys that were going to be in captivity together, and prior to housing them together, they looked at their stress systems and measured the effectiveness of their stress systems and then put them in captivity together, and they formed a hierarchical society. And it turned out that it was the ranking that drove the stress, right? So the monkeys that became subordinate in that artificial society ended up having weaker stress systems that they didn't bring with them to the group before they were in that position. Right? So it is actually that. Now, sometimes being dominant can be worse than being subordinate, and Sapolsky mentioned some of the examples of those. Does anyone remember one of the examples that he gave? These are animal examples where the dominant animals in certain species show the worst cardiovascular response than the subordinates.
And he mentioned a particular type of monkey, but then he also talked about a situation in which the hierarchy is being rearranged or is in danger of being rearranged, and in that case, being dominant was worse.
Yes.
Because they knew that they could lose their dominance.
Right. So in the second case that you mentioned, when the structure of the society is threatened by famine or by encroaching other troops or whatever, then the stress falls on the dominant animals to sort of take care of that situation, right? And so in that case, being dominant no longer has all the benefits that it has. It now has all the weights of that. And we could we talk about executive stress syndrome, and typically it's good to be at the top, but if the company's falling apart, then probably not good to be the executive in that situation, right? He talked about the marmoset monkeys. I think that's the other one that you were mentioning, Blaney. They're cooperative breeders. And so there, the dominant animals spend most of the time like fending off, protecting, finding food, and the subordinates are kind of laying around taking care of the young and pretty much have an easy, non-stressful life. Right? So, and then he also talked about wild dogs and dwarf mongooses, where there's high rates of turnover, and so in order to stay dominant, you're constantly fighting and trying to maintain your level in that hierarchy where there's a lot of turnover. And so in that case, those animals don't live as long. They have more of the negative health outcomes. Okay? So the point of that is to say, typically, in most societies, animals' rankings, the subordinates are the ones that are getting the brunt of the stress, right? But there are some where the dominants are getting the brunt of the stress. And that just points out that it's the chronic stress, right? Not necessarily being dominant or subordinate, but the chronic stress levels that are created. So what good is it knowing that? We start to think about humans. Yeah.
Maybe that there's almost like a threshold that can be crossed, that like being too high up is bad when you're stressed and being
Yeah, but and if we think about this, does your ranking really matter? What is it that really matters?
Kind of like the load or like amount of responsibilities you might have within your rank. Like in the case of like these marmosets or wild dogs, there's more on their minds constantly, and even if they're higher up in the hierarchy. But then say you take baboons, where the alphas can constantly bully the subordinates are always worrying about, are they going to get their kill stolen? Are they going to like be bullied? So it just seems like whenever you have encounter more stressors.
Yeah, so if we start thinking about this in terms of humans, it's really about managing your stress levels, which we'll talk about on Monday, right? And we have the ability to do that. So even if you are subordinate, you are that guy in the Whitehall study who's the lower level lawyer. If he effectively managed his stress, found outlets that we'll talk about on Monday, then it wouldn't really matter that he was in that position, and maybe his health would improve. And it kind of seemed like his attitude in that interview was sort of defeatist, right? He wasn't very interested in engaging in that. All right, so there are interactions, right, then between stress and ranking, right? So there are rewards, right, for being dominant. And so they asked, okay, well, what is it about different species? They asked 17 different questions about different species and whether or not being dominant or being subordinate produces stress in that particular species. And of all these questions that they asked of various researchers, animal researchers that are studying animals in the wild in their environments, they asked, okay, well, what are the rewards of being dominant? Does that matter? What is the role of aggression in remaining dominant? Like the mongooses that constantly have to fight in order to remain dominant. How much grief do subordinates get? Right? How much time do the dominant animals have to hassle the subordinates? What are the sources of coping and support? Do they have outlets? Do the animals have outlets for coping mechanisms? Are there alternatives to competition available? And again, sort of going back to the grief of the subordinates, do the subordinates get in trouble for violating the societal rules, right? For taking food that isn't theirs? I mean, what is the penalty for that? And how often does the hierarchy change? How fluid is the system? And what it came down to, out of all these, and I don't have all the 17 questions up here, but out of all those 17 questions, the two sort of determining factors of stress associated with rank came down to how much are they being hassled and a lack of social support. And I think the good news for humans is, I mean, this is psychological stress, right? And this is coping mechanisms. And so understanding that and actively working to reduce psychological stress and improve social support means that we can change this. And the fact that when the monkeys or animals or whatever changed in their rankings, their health changed, right? Their health changed. All right, so, and think about humans and stress. We talked about the executive stress syndrome and how that's kind of a myth, right? That normally the people that are the executives don't actually have as much chronic stress as the subordinates in companies. And it turned out that they found that it wasn't actually the lowest ranking people in a company, but it was more of the middle management that had the most. So why would that be the case?
Because they have less control over what they're doing.
So they have less control than the executives do, right? But the lowest ranking people have the lowest amount of control, presumably, so why aren't they winners? Because they don't have as much responsibility, right? So the middle management kind of gets it from both ends. Not as much control, but they have responsibility for people below them or more responsibility in the company. And so they kind of get it from both ends, right? All right. But as I mentioned, for humans, some of the good news is that these rankings are largely artificial, and they're based on the perspective, right? So Sapolsky talks about the fact you can have someone who's very subordinate in their work, in their employment, yet in their non-work roles, maybe they're a leader in their church, or they're captain of their softball team, or they're a great parent and their kids love them and respect them, and that, then changes sort of your ranking and your perspective of your ranking. And he talks about how with humans that it's so much more complicated on one side because we have this ability to be in these different contexts, right, that animals don't have. The one exception to that, that he talks a lot about, is socioeconomic stress. And so, and he talks about poverty and what are the risk factors that are associated with poverty. So what are some of the risk factors associated with poverty? Why would low socioeconomic status be associated with greater mortality and greater disease states?
Living in more dangerous neighborhoods.
Okay, your environment, sure. Living in more dangerous neighborhoods.
Limited access to care.
Limited access to health care, yes. What else?
He brought up that a lot of people in poverty also work in multiple jobs, and so there's not less time for social support, even if they were going to have social support.
Yeah. So if you're working, 10 or 12 hours a day, multiple jobs, right, then you don't have time to go to the gym and exercise, right? Yes.
We also have that sleep schedules and things distorted.
Right? Sleep schedules, right? And, think things as that we take for granted, like having an automobile, having a car, right? What is not having a car? How does that impact someone's life?
You have to use public transportation and you're expensive.
Yeah, so what is using public transportation? You have to walk or you have to use public transportation, and what does that involve?
You're on someone else's schedule.
Yeah, you're taking away control, right? You got to go wait at the bus stop for the bus to come, and it only comes at a certain time, right? You have to plan everything around that, right? And it takes up even more of your time now. You're spending your time ineffectively, right? So, so all of that, right, plays into a role. And there's also physical stressors like poor unhealthy eating, right? Poor nutrition, and often increased physical risk in terms of things like smoking or obesity or drinking. Now, so Polsky goes through and sort of tries to debunk a bunch of those, because of course he thinks that stress is the major contributor to this, and says, well, that access to health care isn't really what is making people predisposed to disease. But I would argue in some cases that it does, right? And he points out some of those, like not getting annual screenings for cancer, right, can increase your risk of that cancer developing before it's caught and able to be effectively treated, right? Or not having health insurance and these sorts of things, right? I think those can obviously play a role in that. So, but given that overall being in poverty increases your stress levels, right, then what are the negative health effects that are associated with that? Heart disease is the big one, right? And in general, having lower immunity. Right? We talked about how that can increase susceptibility to different disease states. And it turns out that this, while on the one hand we talk about human conditions being good because we have the ability to try and manage our stress, right? The socioeconomic stress actually can impact us when we're younger and show the effects throughout your life, even if things change, right? And so he talked about a nun study, a study that looked at a group of nuns. Does anyone remember what was the point of that?
It's like even though at a young age they all started living the same diet, the same access to whatever their SES when they were children still plays a factor in health.
Yeah, so they looked at this group of nuns that all joined the convent at the same young age, right? But they came from different socioeconomic status backgrounds. And the ones that were healthiest and lived the longest and had the least amount of disease came from higher socioeconomic status, and the ones that didn't and had more negative health outcomes came from the low socioeconomic status in their childhood. So again, we talked about sort of 3 different stages of impacting the development of the stress system in terms of prenatal, postnatal, and then during childhood. And so the idea is that those effects may stay with you even after the playing field gets leveled in terms of access to all these other risk factors. All right. Even though our life expectancy and healthcare and everything has improved over the years, the one constant across that is that socioeconomic status has always mattered. So even when in the Middle Ages, right, when life expectancy wasn't that long, the royalty lived longer than the peasants lived. Right? So what is the cause if we're sort of minimizing access to health care and all these physical things? Yeah.
I just had a quick question. Do you know whether men have like a longer life expectancy than women?
No, women have a longer life expectancy.
I was just wondering.
Yes. So what is the cause of this interaction? So what is it about socioeconomic status that makes people susceptible to disease? If it's not all the things we just listed.
Maybe the stress of worrying about money?
Yes.
Like being able to provide for family and things.
Okay. And in fact, Sapolsky talks about not only is it stress, but it's the root of that stress may be the fact that you're aware that you're in poverty, right? And it's that psychological stress that's actually the biggest negative, right? The feeling poor is what makes people actually have the greatest amount of stress and the most dysfunction in terms of the stress system. All right, so we'll talk a little bit more about the Whitehall study.
The Whitehall studies blew my mind. Whitehall stands for Whitehall Street, which is where the British there's a Freudian slip to begin. I was going to say British Secret Service is first. The British Civil Service is sort of located there. Perhaps there's been some infiltration. And what they did is there were 2 large studies that took, actually the first one began in the late 60s, but the second one in the 80s and is continuing today, where they tracked basically the lives and health outcomes of first, I think, 10,000 and 18,000 British civil servants.
So one thing I'll just pause this to point out is that the first study that was done in the 60s had about 10,000 participants in it, and they tracked longitudinally their health outcomes and looked at all the different risk factors. But in that study, it was only men. And so the reason they did a second Whitehall study is the second one had 18,000. The reason it had almost twice as many people is that it had men and women, and they looked at the sex effects.
And the reason they did this, of course, is because the British civil, service is a bit structured, as one might think. These are the guys with the briefcases walking down the street, right? That we pick, they're the stereotype we have of the British Secret Service, yes, civil service. And when this began, this study, I think most of us, at least in the popular press and popular thinking, was that the people who are dropping dead of heart attacks are those high-stressed executives, right? That's the stereotype. And what Whitehall showed that not only was that not the case, that the executives were living far away longer than anybody. In fact, the folks at the bottom of the ladder were 3 times more likely to die than the folks at the top.
Sooner.
That's sooner, more likely, thank you. Even me? But what they then also found, though, is that there was a graded relationship depending where you were on this hierarchy. That even those second from the top were twice as likely to die sooner, a greater mortality rate, than those at the top. So basically, as you go up the ladder, or the pyramid, the longer life, the better health you have. They began this with looking at heart disease, but they looked at almost every disease, and they found that that gradient is everywhere. And they found it not just for occupation, but it's now been studied for wealth, for income, education. You find this health-wealth gradient in every country in the world. So it's not just that the rich, on average, we're talking averages, remember. There's always an exception to the rule, but the rich, on average, will live longer, more than 6 years in the United States, longer than the poor.
What was the theory about what was driving that?
You know, but even middle-class white folks like me can expect, on average, to die between 2 and 3 years sooner than the affluent. So this is about all of us. It's not just about the poor. And that was what was so, I think, the big light bulb and what was such a breakthrough about the white hole studies that were done in the UK.
And maybe you can talk a little bit about what were some of the ideas in terms of what was driving that. And one thing that really struck me was this idea of how much control you have over your life, whether or not you can take a break to use the restroom or have a snack.
Yeah, one of the issues is power. Power over, power under. If you think about a CEO, there's a lot of pressure on the CEO's life. The CEO gives orders, doesn't take orders. The CEO has lots of folks to give him or her advice, to ask for help, a lot of support. The CEO gets lots of strokes, has dinner with the rich and powerful. And when all is over, it gets to take their sailboat to Aruba or wherever, And as you go down that ladder, what happens is the ability, the arena we have, I think, to exercise control over our lives, be it our job, or be it just worrying going from paycheck to paycheck, worrying about whether or not one's house is going to make your mortgage payment, whether or not you have enough food in the refrigerator, or at the job, how much control you have over your job. All of that takes a toll on your organs. And we now, it's interesting, beginning to understand how. Tony can talk about this as a doctor much better than I can. But the point is we don't believe in magic, right? There's got to be a way in which the outside, our social and economic environment, can get into the inside. We know how toxics do it, how pollutants do it. But how can our social and economic environments be actually toxic? Well, they can. They can actually basically do among a number of ways in which it can happen. But one of which is triggers, what you're getting at is the stress response. That old fight or flight response that we all learned about when we were, in biology class in high school. When the tiger jumps out from behind the rock, you go, oh my God, and your heart starts to pump, your blood pressure goes up, blood sugar flows through your bloodstream. Also, you can fight or flee. Then the tiger goes away and you go back to normal. But what happens if you're constantly on alert, if you're constantly in a world that's uncertain, if you don't know whether or not your plant is going to shut down and be there tomorrow, if your 401k might disappear, if you're worried about your kid and whether he or she is safe at night, what happens is that these sort of drip of this cortisol and epinephrine flooding through the system apparently wears down your organs.
Which is what we've been saying, right? So this is the data from the White House study, and as he mentioned in that clip, it was not just the top and the bottom, but every single rank had a slight increase in mortality rates and increase in disease susceptibility. So, sort of to summarize the effects of SES, there are physical stressors, right? And those contribute. All these things contribute. And while stress might be the mechanism of the mind-body mechanism, right, of how the our environment can get in and harm our organs in our system. There's also the reductionist approach, and not having good nutrition and exposing to health risks can also cause damage, right, and increase mortality rates. The psychological stressors of low rank in terms of lack of control and predictability is a big one. And then lack of coping mechanisms or outlets is the second one. So again, going back to what we talked about with monkeys, right? The societies that produced the most stress and subordinates were the ones that got hassled, right? And didn't have outlets, which is exactly what we see there. And then with humans, we can throw in a third one, which is your perception of social status, right? Knowing that, that you're the lowest ranking person, and that can play into the psychological stress as well. Both of those, the reductionist approach and the mind-body approach then have serious health consequences, right? So you have chronic disease, and then you couple that with your ability to deal with chronic disease, right? So that's where the access to health care and health insurance comes into play. All right, so we're going to wrap up today with one more clip from Sapolsky, and then so here he talks about, he gives several examples of ways in which, because we're humans and uniquely human, that we can have really bad behavior that can cause these negative outcomes, but we can also change our behavior. We have that ability, right? The low-ranking monkey can't just get up and say, I'm not taking this anymore, I'm going to do something about this, right? Like we can do as humans. And so the point of this clip is that our behavior, regardless of where we are in our environment, really matters.
Whereas if you want to understand why did this behavior occur, you've got to take into account everything from 1 second before to a million years before. Okay, so what do you conclude from that? Ooh, it's complicated. Okay, that's very useful, but how about, ooh, it's complicated, and you better be real careful and real cautious before you decide you understand the causes of the behavior, especially if it's behavior that you judge harshly, because things can really go wrong with the wrong attributions, and we have a very dark stained history of that occurring precisely for those reasons. Now for me, when I look at all of this information, the single thing that I find to be most important has to do with change. Every single biological fact that I've given along the way here is subject to change over time. Ecosystems change. Thousands of years ago, the Sahara was a lush grassland filled with hippos and giraffe. Cultures change. In the 17th century, the scariest people in all of Europe were the Swedes, who spent that whole century rampaging all over Europe, and the Swedes have not had a war in 203 years. They changed. And most of all, brains change. Circuits form, neurons weaken, patterns grow, parts of brains expand, and as a result, people change. And they can change extraordinarily. Some examples of it. Change in people that can occur over the course of decades. A man who moves me enormously, a man by the name of John Newton. He was a British theologian. He was a leading abolitionist, played a central role in the banning of slavery at the beginning of the 1800s in England. John Newton spent the early decades of his adult life as the captain of a slave ship. And after he retired from that, he spent decades as a local parson still investing in the slave trade and growing rich from it until one day something changed in him. Something changed, and he celebrated it in the thing that he's most known for historically in a hymn that he wrote, Amazing Grace. Another example, A man named Zenji Abe, who on the morning of December 6, 1941, was the lead pilot in one of the bombardier squadrons that took off from an Air Force base in Japan and attacked Pearl Harbor. He was one of their star pilots. He led one of the divisions there, and 50 years later to the day, as an old man, he came towards a ceremony at Pearl Harbor commemorating it, as an old man came forward in broken English and apologized to some of the elderly survivors on the ground there, and spent the rest of his life close with some of them. Think about that transformation. If one of those men that he befriended had become a captive as his during World War II, he might have happily walked him to death in the Bataan Death March. And if he had been a captive of one of those American men who had killed him, he might very well have taken his skull as a souvenir, which was a standard thing done in the Pacific during World War II with dead Japanese. And instead, 50 years later, he's writing a letter to that man's grandchildren, consoling them when Grandpa has died. Change can occur even faster, over the course of hours. And the example that just mesmerizes me was the first winter of World War I, the Christmas truce of 1914. Powers that be had worked out a truce that was supposed to go for a couple of hours, and the idea was along the trenches of France, people would be able to come out and retrieve bodies from no man's land and go and bury them. So German and British troops came out and retrieved bodies. And soon, they helped each other carry the bodies. And soon, they helped each other dig graves in the frozen ground, and then they prayed together over the dead, and then they shared Christmas dinner, and then they exchanged gifts, and by the next day, they were playing soccer together up and down no man's land and exchanging addresses to get together and see each other after the war was over. And those truces went on for 2 to 3 days until the officers had to arrive and threatened to shoot these men unless they went back to killing each other. And all it took was a couple of hours to completely reorganize these people's sense of who counts as an us, as an them, and us being all of us in these trenches on both sides, dying for no damn reason, and them being the faceless powers behind the lines, using us as just pawns. And sometimes change can occur in the course of seconds to minutes. Now, historically, probably the single biggest horror in terms of American consciousness from the Vietnam War was the My Lai massacre. A brigade of American soldiers went into an undefended village full of civilians and killed between 350 and 500 of them, gang raped women and girls beforehand, mutilated bodies, utterly nightmarish because it occurred, because the US government covered it up for as long as possible, because ultimately they just did slap me with a few wrists, and because it was not a singular incident, it was one of the nightmares of the Vietnam War. The My Lai massacre was stopped by one man, a man named Hugh Thompson. Thompson was piloting a helicopter gunship, flying over the village, and was seeing American soldiers firing activity. Oh, they're under attack by Viet Cong, landed there, got out, and was viewing the incomprehensible sight of American soldiers shooting elderly women, digging out babies from underneath the bodies of their mothers and shooting them, and figured out what was happening. And Hugh Thompson got into his helicopter, and in the course of minutes undid every bit of training he had had as to who is an us and who is a them. He took his helicopter, landed it between the last group of surviving villagers there, and American soldiers coming at them with their weapons, landed his helicopter and turned his machine guns on the American soldiers and said, "If you do not stop, I will mow you all down." And what is most important to me is none of these guys have fancier neurons than any of us. Same neurotransmitters, same genes, same enzymes, no fancier than any of us. What I think we're left with here at the end is a version of like that inevitable, exasperating cliche, those who don't study history are destined to be able to repeat it. What we have here, I think, is the opposite. Those who don't study the history of extraordinary human change, and those who don't study the science of how we more readily go from the worst of our behaviors to the best ones, are destined not to be able to repeat unbelievable, magnificent moments like these. So let me stop at this point, and if there's any...
All right. So he does such a good job of explaining those examples, but it's, again, gets at what he said, is that as humans, we have this amazing amount of control, particularly over our own behavior and how we're going to then impact our society and our environment. All right, have a good weekend. We'll talk about all sorts of great ways, outlets, 5 major outlets to manage stress on Monday.
Thank you.